Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Matthew Hale. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it, and do all that other stuff that YouTubers ask you to do. So please do that. I post 1 or 2 video lectures on this channel each week where I discuss popular culture, technology, and society. In this video, as you can tell from the title and the weird hypothetical stoner Dobby Peach relationship that I photoshopped for whatever reason, we're going to talk about fanfiction. So to start, what is fanfiction? Fanfiction, or fanfic for short, is literature produced, disseminated, and consumed by fans. Fan authors create these unofficial texts using copywritten characters, concepts, and worlds featured in existing intellectual properties, and then turn them into something new. So if you're someone who's never read, let alone written fanfiction yourself, you might ask, why do people do this? Why spend minutes, hours, or even decades of your life devoted to making, consuming, and sharing these kind of unofficial stories? And especially so if you think about all of that creative energy and labor that goes into this work that isn't directly compensated. Well, to answer that question, you should probably consult with and think through the work of a number of scholars, all of whom we've dealt with to some degree or another in previous video lectures. If you've skipped those, I recommend you click on the card in the upper right-hand corner now and start watching A, so that you get acquainted with that work, and B, so that you get all of the references that I'm about to make. For those of you who have been following along, these names, faces, and ideas should be familiar. So in order to make sense of fanfiction and to answer that seemingly simple question, why do people make and read fanfiction, you have to understand that fans have their own interpretive practices that are not predetermined or dictated by mass media producers, as scholars like Stuart Hall, Janice Radway, and Constance Penley, and others have shown. Fans work like bricoleurs, to borrow a term from Claude Lévi-Strauss. They are what Henry Jenkins calls textual poachers, drawing on the work of Michel de Certeau. And yes, those weird photoshops will make more sense if you've seen the earlier lectures. Fans borrow bits and pieces from the flow of mass and public culture, and then they modify, deconstruct, recombine, revise, update, expand, and mix them in order to create something new from whatever exists at hand. Fans creatively and selectively reappropriate elements of mass culture as a means of forming and projecting their own identities, as Angela McRobbie has made clear in her work, and they use them to express themselves and sometimes even, as Dick Hebdige has shown, resist the dominant social order. Fanfiction readers and writers form communities of practice around the effectively charged texts that motivate, inspire, captivate, or frustrate them. They are also moved by the things that they read, watch, play, or listen to that they feel compelled to make something of their own. Fanfiction can be as short as a few lines, and it can also be an endless, collectively produced epic. So again, why write fanfiction? Well, fans sometimes want to extend a piece of fiction, to explore things implied but not fully developed in a text, a relationship, a concept, technology, or a plot line, let's say. Fans may want to extend a novel, to see what happens before or after a book or film starts. Fans can project themselves into these ready-made fictional worlds and play within them like a sandbox. They can expand or revise character arcs, they can insert characters from one intellectual property into another, explore their sexuality, be funny, kill characters that they hate, or undo a beloved character's death. The fans that I've worked with in my own research often told me that they were so moved and inspired or even frustrated by a particular piece of media that they weren't satisfied with consumption alone. They felt compelled to create something new. The creative process of making and writing allowed them to express themselves, their identities, to build friendships and learn new skills, to escape boredom or depression, to be themselves or to imagine themselves as someone else. People read and write new stories for a variety of reasons, but fanfic is a publicly circulating expressive form and recognizable vehicle for creative action. So how did we get here? Or another way of putting that, where did fanfiction come from? As Annie Jamison articulates in her essay entitled A Prehistory of Fanfiction, fanfiction isn't new, let alone a recent historical product. Although fanfiction is often associated with Star Trek media fandom of the 60s, early science fiction literary clubs and conferences in the 1930s, or even early literary fandom that surrounded Arthur Conan Doyle's adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, its roots go much deeper than that. Let's think back to some rather old literature. Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The subsequent work of authors like Virgil and Ovid or even James Joyce is in many ways fan fiction of those Homeric texts. As Albert Lord and Milman Parry seen here, but actually I don't care for these sorts of photos. After I photoshopped them and pulled the subject out of the background, it feels partial or incomplete or limbs are cut off or something like that. It just feels wrong to me, and honestly I can't explain it other than it irks me, so let me do a little bit more photoshopping and make this look a little bit more sensical. In their 1960 book entitled The Singer of Tales, Lord and Parry argue that oral epic poetry like the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey, the Old English Beowulf, or the contemporary epic Croatian or Serbian singers that they were studying firsthand in the 30s through the 50s generated these sort of long-form epic narratives through the use of a storehouse of oral formulaic patterns. This is what is referred to as Lord and Parry's oral formulaic theory. Lord and Perry contended that these poems were created and passed through live oral composition, and that it's this performance and repetition through time is what led to the unique characteristics of oral epic poetry. There's a lot more that could be said of this landmark study, but the important takeaway for us here and now in relation to the study of fanfiction is that these cultural forms were generated through acts of imitation and repetition with variation. This is, after all, the case for most forms of oral tradition, from fairy tales to myths and folk tales. As stories are told and retold, they change and evolve and develop through each act of repetition, varying as they spread through each performance and as they are shaped by the media or communicative channels through which they travel. There's a lot more to unpack here, but for the time being, I want to make this point clear. Fanfiction and a lot of fans' creative practices are often denigrated or not taken seriously or valued as artistic works in and of their own right, because they're viewed as reproductive or imitative or mere copies. They are seen by some to lack any sort of unique or creative vision or point of view, but like fairy tales, myths, folk tales, to epic poetry and the Homeric tradition, these works are generated through imitation, collective composition, and acts of creative reuse, just like all human social action is in some way. In Poetics, Aristotle argues that human beings have a kind of programmed inherent inclination to imitate the things around us, including the natural world and everyday life, and to find pleasure in works of imitation. In contrast to Plato, his teacher's more skeptical take on mimesis, in other words, imitative acts, Aristotle views mimesis and representative acts as fundamental parts of the human experience. 20th century philosopher of language Mikhail Bakhtin, who we'll be engaging with in much more detail later on in subsequent video lectures, argues that all literary works, all texts, and even all utterances or acts of communication are a kind of reusing, rearticulation, or rewriting of that which came prior. And as such, all text exists in dialogue with other texts and the ideologies encoded within those works. Now, that's all abstract, but we're going to do some interesting work with the concept of intertextuality, which emerges out of the work of Bakhtin and the so-called Bakhtinian circle. So make a note of Bakhtin now and be prepared for this to come back a few more times in later lectures. Modern copyright law was codified in the 18th century. These laws protected ownership of intellectual property from fictional worlds, characters, designs, plots, and so on. Prior to that, borrowing or stealing was a common practice in many literary and creative fields of production. A lot of early fanfiction from the 30s and onward was disseminated through non-commercial means, so as to avoid copyright issues. The most common means of dissemination was through fanzines. These non-official publications were created using early printing technologies, carbon paper, mimeographs, and photocopiers. Although the bulk of fanfiction now is created, shared, and consumed online, fanzines still exist. If you go to conventions or local comic shops, you're likely to find these amateur or non-official publications floating around. They focus on topics from the underground music scene to furry fandom to original comics and anything else. These publications were often traded informally or sold for a nominal cost at early sci-fi conferences that developed in the 1930s and grew in popularity with the launch of 1966's Star Trek and the resulting explosion of fandom and pop culture conventions in the 1960s onward. In the 1990s, with the widespread adoption and availability of personal computing and the internet, fans moved online. Fans in the US and abroad saw a value in the internet. They began to create online spaces in which to build communities and to exchange information and resources about their favorite media. The earliest fan websites consisted of mailing lists, forums, and archives, and typically focused on fan fiction and, to a lesser degree at the time, two-dimensional art. In 1998, fanfiction.net, currently the largest fanfiction repository in the world, launched. 1 year later, the online journaling website LiveJournal, one of the earliest social networking services, went online and quickly became an important space for fans to meet and communicate with one another. This brings us to the question of genre. There are a lot of types of fanfiction, far too many for me to highlight here. If you're interested, go Google with or without safe search on, and good luck. For the time being, I'll name just a few common or notable genres. There's alternate universe or alternate canons in which fans explore the subjunctive or speculative dimensions of their favorite fandoms. They ask, what if? What if Luke had succumbed to the dark side, or what if Minnie Mouse had developed a taste for human flesh? You know, that sort of thing. Then there's shipping, short for relationship. Shipping is a genre in which fans express their desire for one or two or however many fictional characters or celebrities or public figures to have a relationship, and that could be romantic or not. Then we have crossovers, where characters are inserted into an alternate fictional world. In the hurt comfort genre, typically one character will experience pain, physical or mental, and will be comforted by another character. And then there's erotica. If you're unfamiliar with Rule 34, the 34th rule of the internet, that's a thing that you can search for online on your own computer. I'd recommend you not do it in a public setting though, but give it a look. Generally speaking, fan fiction is uncompensated labor that fans do because of their love for texts and characters and fictional worlds, but occasionally fan texts have gone on to become commercial successes. A case in point. 50 Shades of Grey began its life as fan fiction, a response to the Twilight book and film series. Likewise, the Mortal Instruments franchise began as Harry Potter fanfic. Alright, so that's it for today's video lecture. Remember to like the video, comment, subscribe, share, all of those things. And thanks for watching, and take care.